live. It is Tuesday. Monday. November 16th, 2020, 5:01 p.m. As you can see, I don't know what day it is, but I want to talk about Lou Gehrig and Cal Ripken.
Oh, man.
Because, you know, when Lou Gehrig started what became his streak of 2,130 consecutive games played, he had no idea he was starting a streak. He was just playing baseball. And then the next day he was playing baseball again. Don't mind the shotgun blasts in the backyard. It's just my neighbors. Rural life, man. And at some point, somebody noticed that he was doing this every day. And probably somebody else noticed it before he did. And I want to also point out that when Cal Ripken, more than 60 years later, started the streak that would eventually break Lou Gehrig's baseball, considered an unbeatable record of 2,130 consecutive games played, he was probably unaware as well that he was starting a streak. But the thing is, when Kate and I started, then, the thing is, Lou Gehrig and Cal Ripken never consulted about their streaks because they didn't play concurrently, much less was the streak a team effort. But when Kate and I started in lieu of fun, and particularly when we decided that we were doing it every day, and that we really decided that the first weekend when we got to Friday and we were like, are we doing the show tomorrow? And we kind of said, I don't know, I guess we are. And then we did, and then we did it Sunday. And, it was it was a thing. We were pretty aware pretty early that we had a streak going. And there were days, and I will confess this, there were days when the fact of the streak was really the only reason we did the show, because one of us was pretty freaking tired, or Kate had grounded a canoe, or Kate had an interview with Mark Zuckerberg at like exactly the time that we had the show, and she's like, I can't do the show today. I was like, it's okay, you can join midway. And under normal circumstances, sure, if we hadn't already done 100 days of the show, we would have just taken a break that day. But we didn't, because there was a streak and we were doing it together. And one day Kate's power went out shortly before the show, actually more than one day.
Yeah.
And we kind of decided when that happened that if one of us had to do the show by themselves, by which we meant if I had to do the show by myself, we would. Which brings us to yesterday, when I arrive at the cabin in the woods to find the power out 2 hours before In Lieu of Fun. And when the power is out here, I can barely send text messages, and only on 1 in 50 occasions can I send a tweet, because we don't really have cell coverage out here. But I managed to get a text off to Kate that you may be on your own today. The power comes back on with plenty of time, but the internet does not come back. And so I guess I'm the Lou Gehrig here because I'm older than Kate. Lou Gehrig's streak ended yesterday, but Cal Ripken's continued. And so, that sucks. And I am back to 1 in a row as of today. But Kate is at 230 fucking 5. And so I think we can say today that I am not allowed to have fun anymore, but Kate is. But in lieu of fun,
I'm just going to say, I win. I win.
Kate wins. Kate wins. In lieu of fun, we have Natalie Jackson back, and I have been looking forward to this episode since last week because Natalie posted a very annoyed tweet on Twitter, which is where you post tweets, for those of you who don't know that. to the effect that why are all the people being interviewed about polling error in the 2020 election men? And she noted that there were at least some women, as I think she put it, certainly ironically, who had things to say about the subject too. So I racked my brain and thought, who do I know who has been interviewed on the subject of polling error who has two X chromosomes? And facing her challenge, I could not come up with a single person. And so I thought we should rectify that. So Natalie Jackson, welcome back to In Lieu of Fun. So the first question I want to ask is about the feminist complaint associated with the tweet. Why are female pollsters and modelers and election analysts being ignored in the context of this discussion?
So, first off, glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me back. I'm happy to do this. This is always such a fun show. So, first I should mention that the primary thing that was annoying me was these long form interviews of there were at least two of them where it was, oh, let me go talk to my buddy who works in polling, and this is the smartest person I know. And it just happens to be my buddy. That good old boys network in the new generation, whatever we call it when it's young old boys, just in action.
Bros. We call them bros.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Good old bros network.
Yeah, the bros network. And so I do have to say that today I found one of those long form interviews with Ann Seltzer, who, if anyone is someone we should be talking to about this, it's right. Ann Seltzer. So I was very happy to see that. For those who don't know, Ann Seltzer runs a poll in Iowa. She's very well established. She's been doing it for more than 20 years. And she put out a poll right before the election that had Joni Ernst up by about 4 points and Trump up by about 7 in Iowa. And everybody else showed the races much, much closer. It was kind of scoffed at when she put it out. And guess what? She was the one who was right. So if we should be talking to anyone, it's Ann Seltzer. I'm sure her phone has been ringing, but I do think there is a tendency to, there's the bro network, all the guys talk to each other. But there are an incredible number of women who work in political polling. The directors of polling at CNN and the AP are women, and Fox News, Dana Blanton, Jennifer Agista at CNN, Emily Swanson at the AP. Really, in addition to just
the director of polling at Pew, Claudia Dean.
I think she's director of research. Courtney Kennedy.
Sorry.
Yeah, Courtney Kennedy is in charge of survey research. And I've seen Courtney quoted quite a bit. So that's good. But I think there is a tendency to go after men, particularly men named Nate.
People only have room in their minds for one syllable, and Nate is really efficient because it covers two of them, and they're both pretty high profile.
And the other part of the title of his entire blog is basically an area code. So
right.
It's it's just it's very easy.
Yeah. So I think, and just to point out, Nate Silver is not actually a pollster.
Right.
So, it especially irks me when we're turning toward men who are not actually pollsters to explain polling error. And so it seems like in the rush of let's find the loudest, most confident voices that we can, it ends up gravitating toward the men because they're typically more confident, louder, and have larger followings because of institutionalized sexism, where we're more, the public is more likely to trust male voices, and they're more likely to be loud voices. So that's kind of my initial take on the feminist side of things.
So let's talk about the substantive side of things, because I kind of go back and forth about this. The question of how well or badly, let's talk about polling first and modeling second. Since the last time we had you on, it was kind of to critique probabilistic models as an enterprise. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, you look at the national polling averages, and they were a few points off, but they were, they got the big picture right-ish, which is that Biden was substantially ahead. And then you look at it sort of state by state, and you say, well, in the vast majority of states, the polls would give you a pretty good flavor of who was going to win. And in Georgia, Iowa, Ohio, Florida, North Carolina, they would give you a sense there was a diversity of polls, and they would give you a sense that it was very close, that either side could win. In Texas, it would give you a sense that, your one's Democratic hopes aside, this might not quite be the year that it was going to happen, but Democrats were going to do well. And in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, they would give you the sense that the Democrats, that Biden was going to win, although they would give you the sense that he was going to win by a little bit more, or in Wisconsin's case, significantly more than he actually won. So my question is, do you look at this and say, the lesson here is that the polls were sort of substantially off? Or do you look at it and say, the lesson here is the polls get you within the ballpark. There's a margin of error. The margin of error is right there on the product label. And don't make a fetish out of, the polling averages says Biden's going to win by 2.3 points and he won by 4 points. Therefore, there's a problem. Which is the right way to think about it?
I think it's somewhere in between. I'm going to take the classic, it's neither.
Political science answer.
Yes. So there are lots of things, I think, lots of trends that I think come to a head in our thinking about how polls should be interpreted and the use of polls in forecasts and modeling and all of that. And kind of my general hypothesis is that we used to be better at understanding polls as just kind of a murky snapshot of what things looked like. And now we expect that they're telling us exactly what's going on. There are multiple things that have led to that. One of them is simply the fact that we have everything in the world available to us 24 hours a day, and we think the outcome of a future election should be too.
Yeah, why not the future?
Yeah. So the other is we have a lot more polls, so we're inundated with them. They're not media gatekeepers anymore. Anybody can throw anything out on the internet, and aggregators will pick up almost anything. So the gatekeeping function that we had pre-internet, where it had to get on a network to get any attention, is gone. And at the same time, data collection has both gotten more complicated and cheaper. And the cheaper is not necessarily a good thing. So there are a lot of things working together to push this toward, okay, we have a lot of information, we have a lot of data. Why is this not correct? And the answer is because it never was, and it was never meant to be. Does that mean we should just ignore the errors? No. There's very clearly a pattern of underestimating Trump votes. And, that's something that pollsters, myself included, are diving into and really trying to figure out, is this a systemic problem with our data, or are we just really bad at figuring out who's actually going to vote?
And what's your hypothesis about what the answer to that is?
My hypothesis is that we're just really terrible at figuring out who's going to vote. Maybe there is some underlying issue in the data where we are undercounting a certain type of person. That's likely, but that would only be a couple of percentage points at best. If it's this small segment of people, that's not causing a major disruption in our data. What is the fact that, especially in a year like 2020, we rely on a question, something along the lines of, how likely are you to vote? And we have people tell us how likely they are to vote. And 90% of people are telling us they're going to vote. And we know that's not true.
When
so how do we sort that out?
When we're talking about polling numbers, and can we nerd out and dig into kind of this question that you're saying that pollsters have to kind of go back and assess? Because I've been thinking about it a lot. We've talked about it a lot. I disagree, and you're the expert, so I'm just kind of but my intuition, so this is completely just as my much lighter than yours background in statistics and social science research. There's a couple of things. One is that it's a self-reporting problem, and that there might be a really huge delta between how people self-report, whether they report at all, between the types of voters, of people who are going to vote. So let's assume that the people surveyed are all going to vote. Okay. I am thinking that the people who decide to even talk to the pollster in the first place are disproportionately blue. I'm thinking that what they tell the pollster about what they're going to do is also maybe tilts slightly towards maybe blue or liberal politics. And I'm thinking that I've never seen a number when I've looked at poll results of the attempts, of the total N of all attempted polls. So I always get the N of everyone that you guys got in touch with and said yes to completing the survey or completing the poll, but never the number of people that said no. And that would be an interesting number. And the rough demographics of that would be very interesting to me. So anyways, that's how I'm thinking that it's a reporting problem rather than a voting problem. But both are huge issues.
Yeah, so let me dive into a few things that you said there. So one of the common misconceptions that people have, they're why would these people talk to a media pollster? Or why would Republicans talk to a media pollster? They don't trust people. Well, basically no poll that I'm aware of says up front, we're calling from the New York Times. Nobody does that. It's, in fact, most of the time, interviewers are trained not to say who funded the poll to the people answering it because of that, because we don't want to skew the answers. The other thing is that if you look at the raw numbers of polls completed and how they were done in 2020, you'll actually find that a smaller and smaller proportion of them are being done by phone. More and more are coming from online sources. The online sources vary in quality a ton. It's just overwhelming. There are a lot of polls that get into aggregators that I consider to be just not worth the time of day.
Yeah.
And then kind of, let's see, there was something you said right at the end that I was going to touch on. What was the last thing you said?
Oh, I was just saying that the summary of what I was saying was that basically, I thought that this was a reporting problem. and that like people, it was like people said yes to talking about it who were disproportionately blue, and then also
right.
like that they tilted their answers towards what they thought the pollster wanted to hear.
Yeah, and that's where the internet polls come in, those that are higher quality. You know, we test that a lot in the polling industry. Is there a difference between what people are saying when there is and is not an interviewer that they're talking to? And that's where we haven't really found any evidence of the kind of, you're alluding to the shy Trump theory, that maybe they support Trump, but they don't want to admit it.
Yeah.
And we really haven't seen any, you know, people have been looking for that effect since 2016, and we haven't found any concrete evidence of it. But at the same time, it's totally true that there could be some element of reporting error of the type you're talking about. I'm not saying that doesn't exist by any means. I'm just saying I think it's one piece, and I think another really big piece is this trying to figure out who's going to vote thing.
Yep.
But if the error is frequently happening or generally happening in the same direction, that is, whether it's because the Trump voters are shy or because they're less likely to answer the survey at all, or because they're less likely to say they're going to vote, and so we're misapprehending the electorate, we do seem to be overcounting likely Democratic voters relative to Republican voters. So why, rather than correcting for the type of person being polled, under non-college educated white people, why don't they just correct for what Republicans call bias? And if we notice over a long period of time that we seem to be undercounting Republicans, or not Republicans, undercounting people who say they're going to vote for Donald Trump, why isn't the right answer to, weight higher people depending on their survey answers?
Because we don't have anything to weight to, is the short answer of that. We know now that we have an underestimate. We don't know if that underestimate holds true for anything in the future. So there's when we talk about weighting a poll, the general requirement is that there is a concrete, we're 99.9% certain that this is the accurate parameter that we need to set the data equal to. So like the census proportions are what we use. In states that have registration by party, you can use that. In states that don't have registration by party, you don't have anything to use. So part of the issue is that we don't know what to weight to as far as partisanship or Trump support. The other piece is that when you look at the poll of all adults, like you stop trying to sort out likely voters, stop doing any of that. When you look at that, partisanship and everything looks like it typically should. We're not undercounting Republicans in our sample writ large. We're getting undercounts of Trump support in a likely voter model. So
is it about access to phones? Is it about access to like internet? Is that part of it?
It could be. So with phones, the mix is, usually, and again, quality varies a lot, but your high quality pollsters are doing 60 to 70% cell phones. And, so there is a question, are people not answering their phones? Are we seeing a little bit of a breakdown in our sample qualities? Because this was you mentioned earlier, you never see the number of calls they make to try to get the number of polls. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you that the number of calls made to get 1,000 polls is...
Yeah, it's very high.
It's super high.
Yeah. the N of 1,000 that you see for completed polls is usually probably around 5% of the calls that they made. So, we have some research that has shown in the past our data holds up when response rates are that low. We need to look at that again, obviously. My style is, let me attack one corner of this at a time. And so my hypothesis primarily deals with the likely voters, because, that would be a far simpler problem, and it's far simpler to figure out. So if we have a problem with likely voters, it's easier to work with than do we have a problem with our entire underlying data. So, I described it earlier today as I'm going to go blow the candle out before I say the house is on fire. We may have a house on fire. We don't know yet. But my approach is, what does this candle look like first?
Yeah.
But in the meantime, isn't the from a user point of view, it seems to me that if you look at a poll in a race, and let's leave aside the Washington Post's claim that there was a 17-point gap in Wisconsin, because that's an outlier even within this conversation.
Oh, yeah.
But, if you look at a race and the polls are showing it's 5 or 6 points apart, I used to look at that poll and say, people don't win when they're 6 points down in the polls. Mm-hmm. I have a 90+% confidence that if you show me 3 or 4 good polls from a state showing Senator so-and-so is 6-7 points ahead of challenger so-and-so, Senator so-and-so is going to win. And I would be really confident of that. And now it seems to me in this environment, you have to treat the margin of sampling error only as part of the margin of error, and that there's an additional margin of error, which is we don't kind of know what's up with polls right now error.
Well, you're exactly right. But you're right in a longer term sense than you think you are. So in polling, this is maybe one of the communication things that the field needs to work on. In the margin of error is only one source of error. And we have a framework that we call the total survey error paradigm that lays out 4 additional sources of error. We have coverage error, which is the people that you're able to reach. Like when you're polling by internet, who are you leaving out? We have the sampling error, which is the one thing that we're actually measuring. We have measurement error, are people telling us what we want to know? And then there's analyst error, basically anything you do on the back end, weighting, likely voter modeling, anything like that can introduce more error into your process. And non-response error, which is, of course, people who don't answer. So we're measuring 1 out of 5 sources of error, and that's always been true. That's nothing new. It's just that the processes have gotten much more complex as technology has evolved. And I think what we're seeing is different sources matter more, and maybe are entering into the picture a bit more than they were. And again, I think this is probably where the field needs to do some communication work. We also have forecasters and aggregators putting it all together and saying, here's where things land, and that gives it an air of certainty. So it's kind of a multi-pronged problem.
Yeah, so let's talk about the aggregators and the modelers here, because again, I can make a case that the modelers did better than the pollsters, but I can also make a case that the modelers don't say anything, and so they can't be wrong. So if you look at, to pick on Nate's, if you look at the 538 model, you say, well, this exact result was one of their high probability outcomes. Wasn't their highest probability outcome, but it was smack in the fat part of their bell curve. And they, never said there was more than about a 52% chance of Biden winning states like Ohio or North Carolina or Florida. So those all, as Nate Silver would say, tend to cluster, and they all swing in one direction. And so you look at the 538 probabilities and you say, well, they did quite well. On the other hand, if I had looked at the polling averages and said, just impressionistically, what results are likely, this would have been one of the top three that I would have identified. And so what work this giant forecast model is doing over and above sort of scientificizing, that's not a word, but people's gut instincts, I'm really not sure. And so I guess, but if the question is, are they smoothing out a whole lot of really messy polling into something pretty coherent and processable and reasonably accurate, it seems like they are. It's just that I'm not really sure that I understand what accuracy it's adding. I know what precision it's adding, but I don't know what accuracy is adding over what we would have gotten if we'd kind of glanced at the Real Clear Politics averages and says, gee, it looks like he's going to win Wisconsin.
Yeah. So before I go into that, I'm going to say I love your chat, because your chat is currently going on about Popper and Kuhn and the theories of science and history of science, and I love it. You guys are all
we have the unparalleled audience. They're so smart and so
we have a great audience, and you'll be talking to them in very shortly, as soon as you finish your answer and Kate finishes her next question.
Okay, so the modelers and the forecasters. So when you had me on last time, what I was talking about was my experience. So I was one of the modelers and aggregators in 2016 with Huffington Post. And I was talking about some work that I had put out on what I learned, and that my opinion really is you cannot put enough uncertainty into these models to accurately represent all of the polls uncertainty, because of all the things I just said about all the different sources of error that we cannot measure. So I think most of what I wrote in that crystal ball piece has turned out to be pretty vindicated.
Sure
we
has.
talked about that last time, and I think, but I'm glad you brought it up again, because it's a really great, it's a great example. Can you drop a link to it in the chat, actually, so people can see it?
Yeah, let me grab it. So, basically, I think what the modelers, the 538 forecast, had a little bit more uncertainty than some of the others. The Economist, I saw them basically doing the same thing that I had done in 2016. So it felt very familiar, including some of their postmortems. I think like I said, my cat's going to come say hi.
Yeah.
Oh, he was out of here. There are so many polls coming out, and it's coming from so many different directions that if all the polls coming out are saying the same thing, your model has no reason to go against that. And that's what we see happening. All the polls coming out said Biden had a big advantage. Wisconsin, it was 6 or 7 points. 17 was an outlier, but
but 9 was not.
Right, exactly. And so, when all the data is pointing in one direction, there's no way for a model to override that. And the argument is, should it even override that? So it's adding an air of certainty to this, because you have this tool. Aggregation is one thing. It's just kind of putting it together and here's a picture of where the polls are holistically, but it still gives it an air of more certainty. They put confidence intervals around it. They try to visually show that there's room for error here, but no matter what, it gives it more gravitas. And the forecast goes even a step further than that, of saying, based on all of this, here's X% likely to happen. So even with all the steps that people made, and I do think they made some good ones on trying to communicate better and trying to make these products a little bit more helpful to the general public, they still ultimately created a narrative that, the polls are right because, look, we have so many of them. And so Biden is going to win by, this point. The other thing is people are really, the outcome that happened was well within the range of predicted outcomes for all of these models. But people are also really bad at understanding that a 90% probability of a win means it's 90%, whether it's a squeaker or a landslide.
Right. They think a 90% probability of winning means you're going to win big.
Right. Yeah. Right. And that's, in fact, I remember writing an article for HuffPost back in 2016 that said exactly that. This 90% probability does not mean it's going to be a landslide. And that's one thing I think that forecasters can work on in communication.
Yeah, because one of the things that has struck me, and we will go to questions, Ben, after I get asked this question. But
all right, I'll start bringing them in.
Okay. One of the things that I was, I don't know if you remember this last time, but I am kind of a models and forecaster skeptic. I have always been. I've never and it's not polling, but at least with polling, I find it transparent enough that I can pretty reliably make my own assessment about how much faith I put in the polling, whereas the lack of transparency with models and the lack and the forecast aspect of models really grate on me, because I just think that they're so misleading and people are generally kind of innumerate. I think that we have, we do not have great math. We do not have or great math education in this country, especially around statistics and things like that. There are a lot of errors, and I think that those are exploited by some of these models. So my question is very straightforward. Do I, in addition to winning the streak for In Lieu of Fun, do I also win the I told you? Do I also win the I told you so of don't trust models? And I'm going to caveat this really quickly. Don't trust presidential election models. And I'm going to add an additional thing in my favor because they are based also on events that happen every 4 years, and that are sui generis, and every single event is in and of itself its own event, and there can be no modeling or adjustment to a model that makes any sense based on previous events in presidential races.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything you just said. Especially that, I just want to put an exclamation mark on that last point of these things happen every 4 years. They're completely different contexts. Nate Silver posted a tweet today that said, let me actually quote it because it was kind of a good example of exactly the lack of, what I think represents a larger lack of context sometimes. Basically, I can't find it quickly, but basically the gist of it was Susan Collins voted with Trump 40-something% of the time in the Senate and won her race in Maine. Cory Gardner voted with Trump 80-something% of the time and lost his race in Colorado. Seems like there's still an appetite for crossing the aisle among voters. And I'm like, or Maine and Colorado are totally different environments.
Yes. Yes. How do you even start to do that? That's just so
So yeah, you can't make that kind of a comparison, and I think that's a highlight of what you said. I would love to just take a soundbite of everything that you said in that last few sentences and throw it at everybody who wants to trust models.
So I don't argue for trusting models, but I want to make an argument for the utility. Well, no, the utility of a diversity of models. So what we actually need is a model aggregator, because the models are taking polls and aggregating them. That was a joke, people. So, look, I think having a debate as people are looking at polls and saying, and given the flood of information and the flood of polling that we're subject to have a debate about what this stuff does and doesn't mean, what the right way to think about them individually and in combination, and what the assumptions you should make before deciding you know or think you know who's going to win an election, is a useful thing to do. And whether that means doing it, it's getting windy here. Whether that means, how you express that strikes me as a valid question, but having a model strikes me as a way of organizing thought and data.
It can be. I think the utility of models, like, we've always had these things in academia, right? When given their proper context and all the proper caveats, and they can be really powerful learning tools, and we are learning from them. Do they help public discourse and public narratives around an election? Yeah, that's where you lose me a little.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Daniel Burge, let's see how you're dressed and in what sort of seat. Ooh, you are wearing your normal camouflage in your normal habitat, but you're in a different direction. The floor is yours.
So my question kind of touches on what's already been discussed. Is there any reason to believe that the polling error is Trump-induced, and will it correct itself when Trump is not on the ballot? What do the 2018 congressional races tell us about this?
That's such a good question. How much of this isn't really about polling, it's just about Trump?
That is a really good question.
Yeah, that's a question that I have. It's an excellent one. It has come up in the pollster kind of conversation circles already. In 2018, the polls did pretty well. That was indicating that a blue wave kind of was coming in the House. And so there's that angle. And really, I think 2018 kind of led pollsters to say, oh, look, we fixed the problems from 2016. So there is a bit of a hypothesis on the table that this is a Trump effect we're seeing. At the same time, the misses on the Senate elections kind of go against that.
Except the misses on the Senate elections could be driven by the miss on Trump, in the sense that, if you're polling, Maine, and you're asking people, do you want to vote for Susan Collins or I forget now, I've already forgotten her name. What does that say about things? And then you have a very large flood of unexpected Trump voters show up. Well, you may have the right answer based on the sample of votes you expected, and then Trump has completely distorted the electorate by turning out people who aren't showing up in your poll, right?
Yeah. And someone on the chat said, if polls can't deal with exogenous events, how useful can they be? And that's a fair question. Like, what's the next Trump to come up?
Right. Thank you, Frank Valadez. It's Sarah Gideon. How quickly Michael Sean...
It's so helpful.
Michael Sean Winters, who has been on this show, my friend the Vatican Watcher, says that likes to say that there's nobody deader than a dead pope. And I would just point out that a losing Senate candidate is a close competitor. It's the big blue blogger who we have not seen in a long time.
Yeah, nice to see
Big
you,
blue
BBB.
blogger, welcome back.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Kate. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Hear you just fine.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, we've been evacuating our kids from various universities, so between that and work picking up, I've been offline. First of all, Natalie, thank you for being here. I'm not anti-poll at all, but I do have a slightly controversial question about political polling. If polls, the big picture question is, what's the real point of publishing political polls before an election? And my thought is, if they're inaccurate, well, then they're useless or misleading. And if they're accurate, then all of the arguments against releasing exit polls before voting is done apply to the accurate public polling. So why are we doing this, and what public good does it serve?
Yes, thank you, BBB.
Okay. So two pieces to that. So I'm going to grab the exit polls thing first. And the reason that the exit polls are not reliable earlier in the day is simply because the poll is still ongoing. That would be like releasing 1 day's worth of data when you plan to collect data for 4. And it's disproportionate, obviously, because the polls open later in the West Coast than the East Coast and all that. So that's why the exit poll toss-up numbers are not released earlier than they are. That's a little bit different from the overall question of why do we do this? And honestly, what I do now is political polling on the public policy and culture and religion side of life. And that is where I think polling is most useful. I think it's better at telling us why people think and what makes them tick. That's kind of what it's designed to do. It's not designed to figure out who's going to show up in a future election and vote when we know there are like 100 zillion barriers to actually voting that are higher for some people than others. And, so I do think there's value in knowing roughly where things stand. I think if were we to not have this kind of check on where things are, we would be left with things like counts of yard signs and crowd sizes, which do measure something, but they don't tell us where the nation overall stands. So my case would be, we have way too many of these things telling us where we stand, but it is good to have a check to say, so that when Trump says, I'm running away with this election, we can say, well, we have lots of evidence that you're actually not.
Yeah, I think it would be really bad to have no real-time check on statements like that.
What did we do before polling?
We counted yard signs.
We didn't have much media before polling. I mean,
wait, is that serious, Ben? Or are you joking?
I'm sort of joking. I mean, a huge measure of public opinion as prior to polling was talking to congressmen about what was going on in their districts, and sort of individual members traveling back to their districts and talking with people, but it was highly impressionistic.
Yeah, I mean, the public polling as we know it really emerged in the 1930s and 40s. So part of the issue, and this goes back to what I'm saying about everything is at our fingertips 24 hours a day. Part of the thing is that in prior times, people didn't obsess about it 24 hours a day. There wasn't a 24-hour news network media engine to feed. There wasn't a constant need for new content on websites. We even in the 60s and 70s, even when I was a kid, like we got our news waiting 23 and a half hours for the nightly network news. And that was in the 90s, early 90s. And, we got 30 minutes a day of local news and then 30 minutes of national news. And that was it. And if it didn't break through to that national news, it didn't break through. And so I think prior to this huge information age where we're just overwhelmed with all of this stuff, people actually lived their lives and didn't worry about it as much.
I guess that's a little bit my point. I think that it's a little bit of a canard to say that, like, oh, well, how would we know that elections are legitimate and people aren't just declaring themselves the winners and, like, running away with an election without polls? Because I think, like, we managed before, and I do think that it becomes like Ben's like, no.
Well, first of all, you have to imagine that holding everything else constant, which is to say Twitter is still there, right? You still have 24-hour news channels who are going to talk about the horse race. They're just going to do it with no data. And they're going to, But
is it better to have no data and have them talk about it, or to have data that is poor or can be falsely represented and overfitted for the point that they want to make incorrectly, and people believe it more because there's data behind it? Like, I don't know. Like,
I don't know. I think you're entering a territory where there is no control on disinformation in that situation. I would rather have Ann Seltzer come out, and then we actually have to debate: is her poll a harbinger of the future in Iowa? Is she capturing something that the rest of the polls aren't seeing, or is this an outlier poll? I'd rather have that discussion, and she ends up being vindicated, and I'd rather have that be the discussion than having Chuck Grassley on to say, well, in my state, the people of Iowa want Joni Ernst, and they don't want any of this socialism. I think that's a less healthy discussion to have.
Okay, I know we have to go to questions and we're running out of time, but I'm just going to say really quickly, I would rather have Chuck Grassley because I know exactly where Chuck Grassley's motivations lie.
That's because you've never had to talk to Chuck Grassley.
And then the other thing that I was going to say is that, if it was interviewing the pollsters or whatever, or interviewing the pollsters, that would be one thing. We're not doing that. We talk about the data 99 out of 100 times. We talk about the data and never talk to the pollsters or analyze the data. The next time I've heard a fucking p-value on CNN is never. I've never heard them talk about that. Or I guess my point is that and because they're talking and using data, if Chuck Grassley goes on and says all of the voters in Iowa are thinking this, that's one thing. If he goes on and says, my poll says that 73% of the voters in Iowa are going to vote this way, that is a different thing. People will believe a concrete number that you give them. If you tell them that it's based on some type of scientific method, it's a little bit like the Law and Order effect, but it's just basically for all of the anyways, this is a longer conversation, and I just think that it's a very solidly mixed bag of pluses and minuses on this stuff.
Christopher Argyris, the floor is yours.
Hi. Good evening. Hi, Natalie. You mentioned, I think earlier, that response rates for polls is down to around 5%. And I've heard posited that one of the issues with the final results not following the polls is that that pollsters aren't so robust on when they don't get their first line respondents, that they sort of lower the standards, sort of change the criteria by which they go to get that 5% response rate. So I wondered whether you think that there's an issue there in sort of the robustness of going to people after not getting the criteria filled in that 5%. And then somebody else wanted me to ask, who couldn't ask a question, wanted me to ask you. You mentioned that not all of the polls are done by telephone now. How good are these alternatives to the typical old traditional telephone poll?
Yeah, thanks for those questions. Those are actually really closely tied together. There are many different ways to do polling over the internet. The best are where the pollster has gone out and recruited people, say by mail. They've mailed them a postcard and said, hey, please come sign up to take polls. And they've done a random sample generation that way. And so they've brought people in and enrolled them and said, will you take polls from time to time? And they are able to generate random samples of the population in that respect. The less good is just people who have signed up and said, hey, I want to take polls for whatever reward you're going to give me. Even less good than that is there are companies now that do a marketplace of all of that sort of thing. So who can get me this sample of 18 to 29? Who can get me this sample of 65 plus? And they just throw it all together and measure it on some criteria. So the sliding scale of quality is really wide, from really bad to pretty good. One of the interesting things to see this year will be to see if that actually mattered. But that's kind of also the answer to what happens if you don't get enough respondents. There's a continuum of good practices to really bad practices. Good practices are good practices are just, continuing to use the same principles to recruit more samples. So sticking with what you've been doing, just do more of it. That's what most telephone pollsters do. They just keep generating more phone numbers. There are also really bad ways to fill that, just picking up randomly whoever you can get on a website. That would be a pretty bad way to do it. And the way to know the difference is that it's difficult. We talk a lot about transparency in the polling field. If a pollster doesn't give you information about how they've conducted their poll, or you can't tell how they've done their poll, like they give you 2 sentences and you're like, what does that mean? I would ignore that poll completely. Only if it spells out exactly the steps they've taken to get their sample, should you pay any attention at all to it. And that's where I think aggregators and forecasters have not done us any favors, because they're picking up everything, or they're using criteria that is not public to choose. And so really investigating for yourself the quality of a poll is going to be important, unfortunately.
John Blackburn, the floor is yours.
We see poll results used to describe...
Sorry, go ahead.
We see poll results used to describe non-political positions of the U.S. population, gun laws, abortion, other things. Do the results of the 2020 election give us any insight for the validity of those other categories?
Another great question.
Yes, and that's another question that the polling field is very much investigating and worrying about. This was what I was alluding to earlier with the juxtaposition of, is it likely voters? Is it our ability to sort out who's going to vote? Or is there something underlying with our sample? And so that's if it's just likely voters, that doesn't impact the issues polling as much. If there's something underlying in our sample, then that does. So we don't fully know that yet. We don't have strong reasons to believe that there's a problem in the issues area, but we're very much looking into it.
Yves Gaumont, the last question is yours, and I hope I pronounced your name right.
Hi. Yeah, kind of. I was just...
kind of meaning not. How do you pronounce it?
It's hard. It's in French. It's supposed to be Yves Gaumont, but I know people have quite a hard time sometimes.
Fair enough.
We'll remember.
So yeah, I was wondering, do you have any advice for promoting women's voice in the public arena?
Yes. Make sure women
grow a penis. No, I'm just kidding.
Pretty much. In some
I just want the record to reflect that Kate said that. I had nothing to do with it.
That was sarcastic.
To some degree, it's a systematic, society-wide. Every woman knows that sexism exists, and this is the lot we have. What women can do is really just push their ideas out there and continue to say what they have to say, even if you say it in an annoyed tweet, which was how I got here.
I would like to point out that you got here before you sent the annoyed tweet. It actually did not require an annoyed tweet to get you on In Lieu of Fun talking about it.
We already knew you were an expert and awesome, so.
Yes, thank you. That is very true. So excellent caveat there. What men can do, I think the overlooked thing is what men can do is when you're invited to do something, or particularly panels or appearances, ask about who else is going to be there, who else's voice is represented. And if it's
so huge,
an all-male group, you can decline not to do it. Do you really want to be part of something?
And recommend women take your place?
Absolutely. If it's going to be all men, it's going to be criticized for being all men. Do you really want to be part of that? Or would you rather step away and say, how about you put this woman that I know who's really smart and talented and deserves to be there? And bonus points even more if it's a woman of color, because women of color are even more underrepresented. So I think it's, women continuing to say their voice, even when you have to waste the time worrying about stupid sexist shit. But it's also men stepping up and saying, okay, I need to think about this too.
Also, can I highly recommend one of these?
I think, Kate, you should wear that the entire show tomorrow and see if your voice gets taken more or less seriously as a result.
Yeah.
All right. We have wrapped up the hour. Natalie Jackson, thanks for coming back.
Thank you.
And come back anytime you want to talk polling error or triumph or any other subject.
Or complain about men.
Or complain about men. Certainly as a species, we give rise to endless legitimate complaints.
Well, there's a lot of you.
Yeah, and let's face it, we suck. Kate, who's our guest tomorrow?
We have Carrie Johnson on tomorrow.
We do have Carrie Johnson.
It's really fun.
Carrie Johnson, who I was a cub reporter with at Legal Times when we were like 12, and we have been buds ever since. That will be 22 hours and 55 minutes from now. And until then, we don't have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, Kate still has a streak. See you tomorrow.
Bye, Natalie. It was so fun hanging out with you. See ya.